Mary Dussault, the Chief Administrative Officer of the Missoula County, who has had a very interesting past, I found out. A checkered past. And we'll look forward to hearing what she has to say. So thank you for taking the time to come down. And thank you folks for coming out.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. I don't often get to be in a classroom anymore on either side of the desk. My name's Mary Dussault. I'd like to just tell you a tiny bit about myself, just because I'd rather control what information gets out. I'm currently the Chief Administrative Officer of Missoula County. That means I was hired by the Missoula County Board of County Commissioners, 3 folk, to essentially be their Chief Administrative Assistant. I'm not going to tell you anything more about it than that unless you have questions. But I'd like to start at the beginning because I'm kind of the opinion that when we talk about things like ethics and principles and values, a lot of that comes from our own experience. So I'm going to start with a little bit about me, and then I'm going to ask each of you a little bit about you and what you hope to get out of today's discussion. Fair enough? Okay. Well, fair enough. That's what we're going to do. I was born in Missoula, Montana, raised in a French Catholic household. So first thing you need to know is I'm a recovering Catholic. I went into the novitiate of the Sisters of Charity of Providence right out of high school. I was 17 years old. I went into the novitiate believing that my vocation was to be a Sister of Charity of Providence, and was on the road to being a teacher, primarily a music teacher. I left the novitiate after 1 year, came back to Missoula, went to the University of Montana in music, and then I went back to the novitiate for 2.5 years. I'm the only person I know that's kind of ever done that. But I had to get straight in my own head what my conflicts were beyond what I thought that was going to be versus what it was. So it was kind of a sorting through and a growing up process. When I left, I went to the University of Michigan, or Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan, because by then I decided I wanted to be a music therapist. And in those days, and this was a while ago, in those days there were only 2 schools in the United States that dealt with music therapy. And what I wanted to do was work with kids with disabilities and use music as a therapeutic medium. I was arrogant enough in my youth to believe I made this whole thing up, and then I did discover there were 2 primary schools in the United States. One in East Lansing, Michigan, and one in Kansas. Now, being a profound thinker, I decided to go to Michigan rather than Kansas because I thought Michigan simply had to have more mountains. And that was only marginally true, I discovered. After I graduated from Michigan State University with a bachelor's in music therapy, I stayed in Michigan and worked for a couple of years in a community mental health center. And I worked in an outpatient program for kids. In those days, we called it kids with learning disabilities. Today, we would call it kids with, or we called it in those days, kids with perceptual motor problems. Today, we would call it kids with disabilities, or kids with learning disabilities in particular. While I really liked my work, I really did not like the Midwest. And I came back to Missoula, whereupon no one had heard of music therapy. And the only jobs available to me were in state institutions. Now, you must understand, I hate institutional settings, particularly where in the old days we used to warehouse people that we were uncomfortable in having in community. So people with disabilities, people with mental health problems, those kinds of folks, we used to just ship off to Boulder or ship off to Warm Springs, and then we didn't have to worry about them. My view is that these are human beings too, and they deserved to be in community with the rest of us. Part of the reason I believe that is there are 6 girls in my family, much to the chagrin of my parents. My oldest sister was developmentally disabled, and even though she's now, let's see, I'm 60, she's 68, going on 69, my parents never institutionalized her. And so as a family value, we had in our family a person with disabilities that actually I grew up thinking was normal. Just kind of a weird thing. At any rate, I really didn't like the Midwest, came back to Missoula. And one of my best friends was in the Montana State Legislature. And since I had nothing to do, he said, why don't you run for the legislature? And I said, well, okay, why not? My dad was a politician. I grew up in a political household. It was kind of second nature. So I ran for the legislature in 1975 and ended up serving 4 terms in the Montana House of Representatives. In those days, we had way more fun than legislators have now. I can guarantee it. I think we enacted good policy and had fun doing it. I ended up being, in my 3rd session, the first woman majority leader in the Montana House of Representatives, the first majority leader in the country in the Montana House of Representatives. I don't really say that in a bragging way. I was just incredibly fortunate to have that experience. What I really like to brag about is my dad, not at the same time, but my dad had been a state senator. And he had been majority leader in the Senate. So I think we're the only father-daughter majority leader team probably in the country. And my father could never understand why I didn't want to run for the Senate. And I simply told him, because it's boring. You know, there's kind of 50 stodgy folks who really like to think about things. The House is like it's like being caretaker of the San Diego Zoo. There's 100 people and it's just crazy. And I like that environment way better than the stodginess. I stayed in the legislature for 8 years and then decided to run for the Missoula County Commission. And partly because I'd become interested in a lot of local government issues. So I ran and I won, and I served on the county commission for 12 years, Missoula County Commission. We happened to be the first all-woman county commission in the history of the country. I don't know why that seems to follow me wherever I go. And that was pretty fun. Then I ran for re-election for my 3rd term, and I got beat in a Democratic primary by someone who was more liberal than me. And boy, was that a shock to my system. But that was true. But it was also a good thing, and I took advantage of that, and I went ahead and worked on some projects that I cared about, and then I got recruited to an organization in Portland, which I actually might talk a little bit about. And then got recruited back to Missoula to be the Chief Administrative Officer of Missoula County. In between some of those things, I worked for not-for-profits or managed not-for-profits as part of that checkered past. So that's me. So you can see that my upbringing is French Catholic. I'm in recovery. I used to be an extremely liberal Democrat. I'm now a progressive cynic, so I'm in recovery. And I think that just happens as one gets older. I don't know. So that's me. What I'm interested in today is not talking at you a lot. I'm really kind of interested in who you are, what your perspectives are, where you come from, and what you want to get out of this conversation today. Let's start with you. Who are you?
My name is Jenna Zelzer.
Say again?
Jenna Zelzer.
Jenna, okay. From?
Cascade, Montana.
Cool. I actually know where it is.
Oh, that's great.
And what would you like to get out of today?
Something about ethics, I guess.
Anything in particular?
Something I can apply, something in my life, I guess.
Okay. Do you think ethics is primary or derivative? Do ethics precede values, or are they derivative from values?
It's a derivative.
Interesting. That's yeah.
My name is Tim Romick. Currently, I reside down in the Bitterroot Valley. But
That's where my mother was born.
Okay. My main question would be the ethical dilemmas deriving from your experience in local, state, and regional government, but also with the previous mayor who was here the last visit. The cynicism that you brought up, I noticed for people sort of my same sort of views, it's difficult not to be cynical, and he was kind of discussing that and how you know, for the time that you've been in government, you've seen it as exciting. It was progressive. You made a lot of changes. You saw it happen from a grassroots level. But then someone for me came along a few years later saying, well, it's hard. It's difficult not to be cynical because how can we possibly enact change in the sort of system that we're seeing today?
Okay.
So that's
Okay, thank you. Let's say this back to you. One of the things that I learned about change, and Cindy Cletty and I worked together for 104,000 years, and I think there are two very different kinds of opportunities for change, particularly if you have a set of core values, okay? Because I think if we have a set of core values or our own kind of internal compass, we see things not necessarily as they are, but the way we'd like them to be. And of course, then we believe we're right about that. That's the main thing. We think we're right about that. My sense of that, one of my senses of it comes from having worked with folks with disabilities. Now, when I work with a kid with disabilities, or different abilities, as we say today, if I expect that person to make huge leaps, I'm setting that person up for failure. But if we work on incremental changes over time, small steps, we see huge results over a period of time, developed incrementally. And for the most part, at least in government, that's how change occurs. Cindy, would you think that's essentially true? I always say of the legislature, when people say, I want to go there and I want to get this done, I say, great, plan on 8 years. Because significant change, if you're going to work through the legislative process, and it may even be longer now because of the phenomenon of term limits, which is probably the worst thing that has ever happened to public bodies, is term limits. And we can see it in today's legislature. But if you have a really good new idea, it takes about 4 terms or 8 years to get through that process. You'll introduce it in the first house and it dies in committee. The next session you go back, you get it out of committee and it dies on the floor. The third time you go back, you get it out of committee, you get it out of the one house over to the next house and it dies in committee. But what you're doing all that time is you're educating, talking, debating, and all of that. So incremental change. Now, every now and then, and I would suggest to you, you will never know when the opportunity is going to be. But if you have in your head what it is you want to change or make happen or do, that there will be some, I don't call it an alignment of the stars, call it whatever metaphysically you want to call it, but there will be an opportunity where things converge. And if you're ready, and you take advantage of that, you can travel those 8 years or those light years in a nanosecond. But if you haven't thought about it and you don't have a plan, you'll miss that opportunity. So, when I say I'm a progressive cynic, I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I do believe we're all individually and organizationally capable of making progress. It's only a matter of whether it happens incrementally or in that nanosecond, and we've just got to be patient enough to know the difference, I think.
But you're wondering why?
I'm wondering, what do you want out of today?
Well, I've always been interested in the question of ethics, and I'm also a great admirer and friend of you, and I haven't seen you for a while, so here I am.
Thank you. What do you want to talk about today?
I want to listen to you.
Oh, gosh. That's a lot of pressure. Any particular aspect of anything?
Well, I assume you're going to mainly talk about how it is that the county commissioners. I guess one other thing I did wonder about, are you the first administrative officer? Did they get along without one before? Because I've never been aware of that position until you came along.
For as far back as I can remember being aware of the county government, which probably goes back into the 70s, once I kind of started in government, the Missoula County has always had a chief administrative officer.
But I wouldn't be able to name them,
Yeah.
so you.
Yeah, I'm the first woman. Isn't that funny? I don't know how that happens. At least I think I am. I think I am. But and it's a great job. I love it. I get paid more than the electeds. I shouldn't say this on TV. I get paid more than the electeds. I don't have to run for office. And somehow working in the trenches, having had the experience of being both an elected official and the capacity to work in the trenches, there's something really wonderful about being able to work in the trenches, and I think in a practical way get more done. So it's just.
Well, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Dane Scott.
Hi, Dane.
And you've been talking about things that I was hoping you'd talk about. Some of these things on incremental change, being opportunistic, actually, rather than and by knowing where you're going. So I think those are really good. But what about Missoula's changing so fast? Missoula County is changing so fast, and yet government moves incrementally. There's some changes that once they happen, there's almost no going back. And yet, I've been thinking about the climate change issue. If we don't act in this country, it's kind of out of luck. And yet, things move slowly, particularly in this particular issue. But I can even think about it in terms of growth issues, and the way things happen. And there's conflicting core values in different members. So I see a lot of ethical issues arising from development. In rapid change, incremental change, different sets of values. There's a lot of things going on
How did we get into the C word thing?
there. Yeah.
Cynicism, change, core values, conflict. There's something. I'm going to leave that up there, then we'll come back.
I'm interested in since you brought it up, I didn't hear about it, but I'm interested in the connection to religious issues. And I did a lot of research for a doctoral dissertation that I never finished. It's on hold, possibly permanently, partly because people couldn't answer this question, which is the connection between religious values and politics. And for people who have left the church, why do they still all act the same way in regard to politics?
How do they act?
With this one group of people, that's the question. I was looking at Catholicism in the early New Left and finding incredible similarities. People for the most part, Jack Kerouac still called himself a Catholic, but Tom Hayden and R.S. Savio and all the early New Left people, all the figures they were using for their leaders. People like Camus and Michael Harrington with the Catholic worker and then the socialist movement and various other figures. And they couldn't articulate. Mario Savio is probably the one who could have, and he died right as I got the proposal approved. But I found that fascinating. I would find myself in a position of actually telling them what they probably thought. No, you were raised to think all souls were equal before God. That might mean that you think people who are handicapped, should have, and what does this training mean? And what does all of, the Bible and the church history? It's not about dogma, it's about what your mom told you. Eugene Debs and all these various figures in history. I was trying to figure out how religion is connected to politics once you take the dogma away and the church structure away. And they couldn't answer the question. They couldn't articulate the connection between their religious beliefs and their politics, which I found absolutely fascinating. They'd forgotten what had been drummed into them for 20 years. Interesting. By the time they left. So that's the question I'm interested in.
let me take a quick.
She's going to be the first person who's going to answer.
No, let me just take I'm going to give you kind of two one-liners almost. First of all, when you talk about moms, you know, my mom passed away within the last couple of years, but I swear, I mean, part of the reason I'm not a good liar, and I've learned to differentiate, and I'll tell you how I differentiate it, but I was convinced, I mean, my mom was a really smart woman, and of course I didn't like her at all for a long time, and I grew to love her, of course, as she aged and died, but I swear to God that we didn't have microchips in those days. I swear to God there was a microchip in my head, and every time I would tell a lie, it would go, liar, liar, because she always knew. And so I kind of got trained out of lying because I got the crap beat out of me because my mother knew I was lying. Well, of course, mothers know when kids are lying. It took me a while to figure that out, right?
I never did.
You never did? Well, see, maybe there was this little chip in my forehead. So I have a really hard time not telling the truth, and partly because I suspect of my mother, partly because of those things you learn as a young Catholic growing up that you're not supposed to do that. But I also remember as a young, probably in my early teens, struggling with some questions like, and they're the classic little philosophic questions. And I actually remember how we framed it in class. If I am asked by somebody who's going to hurt you a question, and if I tell that person the truth and they will hurt you, should I tell that person the truth? I mean, it's kind of the theological, philosophical side of, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, doesn't make a sound. But I remember pondering that as a kid. And I decided in the end I would lie. I would lie and commit a sin to protect a person that I cared about. There was no doubt in my mind. I'd lie to protect an animal. I'd lie to protect something that I cared deeply about. Now, I also learned that I was taught that that's a lie. And I actually don't even think that's a lie or a sin, because I don't think in those terms anymore, right? But it was the question posed to me at some point very early on, and for some reason I pondered it. And I'll be darned if I remember even why I pondered it, except it bothered me. So I guess that's kind of my mom and some set of values. I can tell you what happened to me, and it's why I went into the novitiate once to train to be a nun, and left, and then had to go back to figure it out. When I asked you the question about our ethics derivative or not, I like your answer. I agree with you. I think they're derivative of a set of values. I'm not sure I can explain this. My sense of being brought up Catholic is that the ethics, or the list of do's and don'ts, was what we were taught was primary. Thou shalt do. Thou shalt not do. But even though I went through grade school and high school in a Catholic school environment, I don't ever kind of remember being taught the values and principles from which those ethical standards, if you will, were derived. Okay?
Interesting.
Okay. Once I went to the novitiate and actually started studying religion and comparative theology and all that kinds of stuff, which I have to admit I still find pretty interesting. For one thing, I learned that Catholicism was derivative. I didn't know that. Nobody ever told me that. Catholicism is derivative, right? The themes of Catholicism are derivative from very ancient religions. Well, that was news to me, and I tell you, it kind of ticked me off. And then I started thinking about blind faith. And I didn't like blind faith. I like knowing what I believe in and why I believe in it. So I was mad at the Catholic Church because they didn't tell me these things. Okay? So I left. And then I decided I had to get over being mad and I had to go back and figure it out. And what I finally realized and why I could not commit to that life was because what I was being asked to do was behave in a derivative manner, if you will, follow the rules. When I questioned those rules, you're taught obedience. You're not taught to question things, you're taught to obey. And I didn't like that. I came to have a tremendously deep and profound love of the concepts of faith, hope, and charity. I came to have a profound love of the concept of poverty, but it's a concept of poverty. And to me, poverty, behaving with a notion of poverty was not the same thing as the ethic of not using too much toilet paper when you went to the bathroom. Okay? So for me, that was why I could not make a commitment to that lifestyle. Because I couldn't behave solely in a derivative fashion, if you will. I couldn't simply adopt the code of ethics without truly embracing with a community of people the primary. And for me, in the end, I didn't find it there. That's the best I can describe it.
Sounds like bad teachers.
Derivative teachers. Cindy.
Well, as you know, my background is different from yours.
Yes.
I come from a French Huguenot, Scots Presbyterian background, where we were very respectful of authority. We tended to also be very suspicious of it, questioning of it. But one of the things that perhaps is shared in common among those cultures is a notion that in order to do well, to solve problems, public service is extremely important. That sense of giving to community and the notion that community can solve problems, can nurture, protect, and care for people, which is essential and important. So I came to government with that kind of a notion, that government is where, particularly on a local government level, you can affect change that serves people, that builds community. I appreciate your comments about how change, when it's most effective, happens incrementally. We can wreck things very quickly, but we can build firmly very slowly. But from an ethical standpoint, thinking about ethics, it interests me how we have a sense in our community and elsewhere that change in government happens through political process. And politics is a matter of power, wielding power, being strategic, being tactical, outwitting, outsmarting, in some ways vanquishing, very power-oriented, which is quite different from, I think, a public service ethic, which is giving of self, supporting, and building. And so it's interesting to me how local government, how ethics play in that, how to reconcile those two notions, the politics, the power orientation, and the working, the giving, the selflessness of the service.
Have you been watching the legislature?
From a distance.
Over the last couple of days. As you know, I find, and I suspect you would agree, that notion of politics as power, and I need to tell you, I'm really good at that. I know how to play that game as well as anybody. That's why I was majority leader. So I can play it. But it is far less evident at the local level than it is at the state and at the federal level. And remarkably so. It was something I was very surprised at learning. I would tell you that even though there are 2 Democrats and 1 Republican on the Missoula County Commission, there are no partisan politics on that board. I don't think I've ever seen it. I don't think I've ever seen true partisan politics raise its head at that level. I would even submit to you at the city council level, you don't see that very, very much. What you see is a difference in values that are articulated. And in the end, you're going to have a vote, and I think one set of principles and values and views is going to triumph over the other at that moment in time. I'll tell you a little story about the legislature, and if my pager goes off, it's because there's so much going on right now, I think I have to know it all. How many of you have been watching any of that, particularly around this appropriation stuff? Somewhat. Interesting. So you haven't. That's great. That is so interesting to me. So the Democrats control the Senate, the Republicans control the House by 1 vote, and the Democrat controls the governor's office. The theory normally is that actually government at that level works best when there is not one party in control. It doesn't work as well when you got a Democrat in the governor, Democrat House, Democratic Senate. That when you've got a split, that's better. That ain't happening this time for a whole lot of reasons. But to illustrate maybe the difference between a sense of public good versus a sense of power, normally the legislature has a bill that is called the appropriation bill, and it funds all of government for the next 2 years. For the last 30 years, that's been one bill. They call it House Bill 2. And House Bill 2 is essentially the governor's budget. So it gets introduced into the legislature. They have joint subcommittees between the House and the Senate, and they have hearings on the bill, and then they change the bill, and then it comes out to the House floor, and then it gets passed to the Senate, and then all kinds of things happen to it. Well, this year, the Republicans did something which I think is actually pretty interesting, and they took that House Bill 2, which was the governor's budget, and it's a procedure called they put it on the table, which means it's just laying here. It's not dead, it's just laying here. And they introduced 6 different bills, so they broke that budget into 6 parts. Well, boy, did that surprise the heck out of everybody. They couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. And now everybody's mad. And everybody's mad at the Republicans because they did this. So those of us who have an interest in what's in House Bill 2 or in one of those 6 bills or more of them had to say to ourselves, do we want to follow the party line? And the party line is being scripted by the governor. And the party line is we must all oppose those 6 bills and try to kill them so they can get House Bill 2 back off the table. And we made what I believe was the principled, valued, and I'm not going to say ethical because I'm not sure right now I think there's any particular ethical choices as I would describe them in this, but I think the principled choice was, look, we don't care what vehicle you use. We don't want to engage in your infighting. What we care is what's in those vehicles. Whether it's 1 vehicle or 6 vehicles, we don't care. So our position in committee has been not to side with the Democrats and not to side with the Republicans, but just say, we don't care, but here's what we would like to see in that bill. We have successfully ticked off, not the Republicans, oddly enough, but the Democrats, including the governor. So in the end, if any of those people want to play power politics with us, what they will do is kill our initiatives in order to teach us a lesson And I don't know if that will happen or not. I kind of don't think so because we're right. I mean, we're on the side of truth and justice and right. Because a lot of it has to do with the level of human services funding. But in that kind of an environment, with that kind of political wrangling going on, we can forget what the purpose of the appropriation is, which is to fund public services for the next 2 years. And it really ought not to matter too much whose car they're driving down the road, I think. So I think that speaks to the notion. And the problem is there are some folks in the legislature on both sides of the aisle that don't like at all the wrangling that's going on and really want to do the right thing. But the leadership in both parties right now are trying to tell them what to do. And they're having a hard time. I think in the end they'll do the right thing. Whatever they believe, based on their values, the right things to do are. So what do you think about what we've talked about so far? I want you to answer the question about the changing pace and core values and conflict and what we should do about land use planning and global warming.
We don't have to do global warming.
I know, but it was just a good example.
I'm not sure. I guess I kind of wanted to, have you, talk about ethics and any ethical dilemmas you've had in your time in government. And like you just kind of gave that example right there, but.
Right, and that's more often the kind of example that you would hear from, I think, most of us. The standard code of ethics for people in government is thou shalt not take a bribe. I've been in public service for 30 years. I've never yet been offered one or seen one. I think there's something wrong with me. I don't know. I mean, truly, never. And I don't know truly of anyone who has. I mean, I've never seen, this under the table stuff and all that. So thou shalt not do that. That's one of the thou shalt nots. Thou shalt declare a conflict of interest, which means simply that I cannot personally benefit from any act as a government official. What does that mean? It's a hard one. Every time I present a budget to the Board of County Commissioners, it has my salary in it. The only thing I can do is disclose that and make it public so you all know what my salary is as well as anybody else. In the end, I don't vote on it, but the commissioners vote on their own salaries. So as long as it's disclosed and open that that's what they're doing and you have the ability to comment on that, I think that's the essence of declaring a conflict. So it's the declaration of a conflict, not the fact we all have conflicts. The third rule is acceptance of gifts, and this is always the big one. How can you possibly go out with a lobbyist and have them buy you a drink? Well, because you can. I mean, anybody who thinks, you can go one extreme or the other here. And some people do this. They can say, no, I'm sorry, you can't buy me a drink, I'll buy my own drink. Have lobbyists bought me a drink? Of course. Have I bought lobbyist drinks? Of course. The issue is whether or not that person who has been bought a drink or something of value does something as a result of that. Now, some people think the only way to be sure that doesn't happen is not to take the gift. Most of us would say, and what I would say is there is a certain value over which we should not go, and the standard is about $50. I mean, and I just think it's almost kind of funny. I think somebody that's going to be influenced is going to be influenced if they get a pack of chewing gum from a lobbyist. I don't think they have to get a $50 belt buckle as a gift. If somebody's going to influence you and you're influenceable, it's as easily done with a pack of gum as a night out on the town. Wouldn't you think? Because the problem here is with, I should not pick on you, but your core values, right? So what do you think about that?
I don't think I'd be influenced by a pack of gum.
But, go ahead, but, would you be influenced by a drink?
Hopefully not. Maybe, like, no, probably. I hope not.
Okay.
Maybe
So-
$1 million.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Therefore, the $50 limit, which is statutory, which is the statutory limit. But you?
I'm kind of interested in how these values, you're kind of in a political setting, have this conflict between party and the types of things that are expected and ways to vote for the party, and then these personal core values, and then how that can be compared to individuals in their everyday living and how they have their values and what they think should be right, and they also have this emotional appeal and how they battle that to make their decisions.
Let me take a crack at that, and then I'm actually, the last few minutes, I'd like to hear what you all say about that. I think you hear a lot about moral compass, right? That we either individually do or do not have a moral compass. I worked for an organization after I got the boot off the county commission. I got recruited to work a job in Portland, Oregon for a not-for-profit whose mission was doing conservation-based economic development in the coastal temperate rainforests of North America. Would you like me to say that one more time? I mean, I was really attracted to this organization for a couple of reasons. One is I thought I sensed it as somehow, you know, it's kind of like in my mind, I was trying to integrate music therapy, music as an art with a therapeutic medium. This was kind of taking a conservation ethic, principle, but understanding that to really have a conservation ethic, you really have to have a good, you got to take care of people and how they work and where they work. So you've got to do a kind of an added value kind of a thing, inculcating conservation principles into helping people make a living. So on the coast, we would work with fishermen and help them change their fishing practices so it did not harm the area in which they were fishing, and then help them create markets for that fish, which is now more expensive. It's kind of like the difference between farmed salmon and wild salmon. Nobody can possibly argue that we ought to be eating farmed salmon. And I just encourage all of you, when you go to a restaurant, you ask them the question, and if it's farmed salmon, you say, shame on you. You ought not to be trying to sell me farmed salmon. And I am willing to spend $1 or $2 or $3 or $4 more to eat Alaska wild salmon. But then our responsibility is to help create markets for the wild salmon. So anyway, that was kind of what that organization was about. It's the first organization I ever worked with that actually had an organizational moral compass, and they called it True North. And whenever we were dealing with any sort of an issue or a question, the discussion was brought back to the compass. And the question was, where did this issue lie in the compass? If it was True North, it's something as an organization that we did. If it started to fall into that lower quadrant, I mean, that meant this is not a feel-good thing. So both organizationally and personally, I think we all have that, most of us have that moral compass. So the dilemma of some of the legislators now is, because of the pressure of their parties, they're being asked to do things that are in conflict with their moral compass. because they want to support funding for human services. They want to support funding for education. They want to do these things. They want to provide good tax relief. But the parties are pulling them in one way or another. I think the good ones right now are having conversations with their leadership that says, I can't do this. You've got to understand, I can't do this. And if you ask me to do this, I can't follow you. And there will be some who will follow blindly. But I think the true leaders in the end are not necessarily the leadership, but those who stand up to the leaders and say, I can't do this. And here's why. Here's why this is how this doesn't work for me. And those are the folks who are going to come home, and you know what? They might get beat in the next election. They might be beat by their own party in the next election. And the question is, so? Okay, we're almost out of time. Anybody else that wants to comment? Tell the rest of us we're just full of garbage.
I have a question for you. You talked about the core values and how that dictates a lot of the decisions you make, and you said that you didn't find that in the Catholic Church. So where do you find that? Where do you find
I find parts of it there. I mean, I guess I became kind of a little bit more egalitarian and probably not very. I think I just came to realize that for me, the Catholic Church was a part of something larger, and I needed to understand that larger view. And so if you asked me what I am, I'd say I'm a recovering Catholic. I find a lot of value in a lot of places. And I think as I grow older, and as you will grow older, you will find those values in different places and probably incorporate them, because I don't think we're born with them. Just like I don't think we're born with original sin. I think that's a crock, with all due respect. I think we're a vessel, and whether it's from nature or from intellectual pursuits or emotional pursuits or whatever, that is, we grow into mature human beings, following that compass and accepting the consequences for whatever it is at that point in time. I'll tell you my favorite last story. So I'm a Catholic. My family's against abortion, and I've got to take a position on abortion. And the truth is, I hadn't thought about it very much because I was a Catholic, right? But I'm in the legislature, and I've got to decide. And I think and think and think and think about this, and I finally think in my own mind that there is a difference between what I would do personally, and whatever choices that might be, and what my duty and responsibility is as a public official and having to consider everybody. And I finally decided that it wasn't up to me to make that decision for you or you or you, that only your own moral compass can do that. I got a call from the Catholic bishop, who called me in and said, you will not. I mean, it was, you will not, or you will. And, I thought about that for about 30 seconds. And I said, and he said, or I will excommunicate you. Now, this is a pretty high stakes game, only he wasn't playing a game. And frankly, I was a recovering Catholic by then, so I didn't care, because I wasn't going to give him that kind of power over me. And what I said to him, I said, that's really interesting that you would take that position, because are you aware of the Catholic Church's position? And I knew the date at that time, I don't remember, but in the early days of the Catholic Church. And he looked at me like I just landed from Mars, and I said, well, if you'll recall, The Catholic Church's teaching at that point in time was that you could abort a female fetus, but you could not abort a male fetus. And I said, so don't you ever tell me again what to do. And if you feel like you need to excommunicate me, you go right ahead. Because I'm not in the legislature to do what you tell me to do. I'm in the legislature to do what I believe is right, the right thing for the public. I don't know if I ever got excommunicated or not. I never got, I don't remember if I got a letter or not. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Yeah.
It's been fun. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm sorry we couldn't do global warming.